Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's me, Diana, coming to you first in 2023. It's me, your friend Jackie.
That's a little pitchy there.
Thank you. So that's a no for me, dog. That's a no? That's a no? That's a no? I'm Nobody just
It's
likes that one?
not,
I think it sounded nice.
Okay, I'll work on it. So, if you haven't been listening, I've been trying to sing my name, and no one liked that one.
It's like you almost had like a Chartreuse sort of torch song thing going, and then it just kind of
pitched out.
and it's a little too ghostly.
It was ghostly.
It's because I'm dead.
Oh no! Oh,
All right. Anyway,
if only Jackie were still alive. Everybody, quick! What verbal operant am I talking about there? Because, of course, we don't just talk about singing on this podcast. We talk about behavior analysis, behavior analytic research, in which every week we pick a topic related to the field and some relevant research articles. And I thought this one, that statement, like I wish Jackie were here, would go nicely with the theme of today. Do you remember which one that would be?
Manned.
But what kind of a man? I just said it 2 seconds before we started
Magical
recording.
man.
The magical man.
where's my wand?
Man, I wish it
I
weren't
assume
raining.
that would be the most delicious manned if you were
The
to eat
magical
manned.
man. Mm-hmm.
Frosted magical manned.
I like the pure manned.
Oh
yeah, because
'Cause
you're
it's
all
like
about like
healthy.
clean eating.
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm more going the Lucky Charms route.
People who go all about pure mans, they just drive me nuts. They're always talking about their pure mans. It's just
So
like,
high and
sit
mighty.
down, God. If only we could all be so great to use pure mans. Yes, we are talking all about manned or
Can you
teaching
believe we've never
mans.
talked about manding?
No, we have talked
We talked about
manding.
manding.
We talked about manding with Sarah Lachago.
Well, don't worry. I will bring that up in pairings.
Oh, great.
But we've
But-
never had an episode that was just like
No,
manding.
I know why. Because
it's on the task list to just teach. You should know man, so it doesn't go beyond the task list, which is always our goal.
No, because
We are going to go beyond.
Well, that's the point of
it
today's
is-
episode. Yeah,
It is hard because manding in verbal behavior is hard for me.
I think
And-
none of us are verbal behavior experts.
Right. I think that's the problem.
Have I told you guys all the story of how I prepared for the verbal behavior section of the BACB exam?
No.
You read the book.
No, I chose to read the book for fun many years later. When I had to learn about verbal behavior, it wasn't really talked too much about in the classes I took because I was a special education master's student. And so I was in the parking lot waiting to go in to take my BACB exam, and I said, crap, I don't think I know anything about this verbal behavior chapter. So I very quickly skimmed the chapter in Cooper, Heron, and Ewart before I went in, and whew, apparently there weren't a lot of questions about it, or I remembered just enough
Wow, that's
to
all
get
you
through.
have to do?
I don't know.
Jeez.
Maybe it was not a high verbal behavior year.
Yeah, that could be. It was quite a long time ago.
It was a long time ago where I think everyone kind of came back to like, you know what, verbal behavior, it's the coolest, which we do think it's super cool, but I don't think it was as
It was
hot.
not as heavily focused on
Yeah.
in the
Oh,
fourth
not at
edition task list
Yeah.
as it is in the fifth.
So
And
whew,
I guess we took that under the fourth or the third. Does anyone know?
I don't know. That was
I took mine out of the original. I'm just kidding.
I don't know. I mean, we all did it the same probably, but
Yeah.
2008, so I think I was the same.
2006.
yeah.
Okay, so I think it was the same task list. I don't remember.
I don't know.
I'm gonna look it
Anyway,
up.
it was a long time ago.
Anyway, it was a long time ago, and I did penance later
Galaxy.
by choosing to read verbal behavior
Far
for fun with a small group of peers. So I have made my dues. I've paid my debt to B.F. Skinner and verbal behavior, and I'm very excited to be talking with you about teaching mans. Again, a topic we've discussed, but never in, I think, this specific
Right.
way.
No. Yeah, which is kind of exciting. You were probably one of a very, very small percentage of humans on Earth who chose to read verbal behavior with no reason.
Like gun to my head, I have to do it.
Yeah, I was like, what's the word I want to use?
Like Dave Palmer, I'm
Right.
sure. Yeah, I know he loves
Yeah,
all
there's a
Skinner's
really
right.
a real subset of people who are like,
Mark Sundberg probably
let's just
has it on
crack
his
this open. I don't have to.
nightstand
Just
all the
want to.
time, just in case.
Yeah, so you should feel really good about that.
Oh, I do. Thank you. I do. I feel great now.
So we're gonna learn all about mans today.
We're gonna. Well, I don't think we're gonna learn all about mans, but we're gonna learn.
I oversold.
Diana, have you seen that chapter on mans? All right, that thing's like a third of verbal behavior.
You're right. We're gonna do the basics on how you might teach mans.
Yes, we're
Understand
just focusing on
what they are
that
and
piece
teach
of
them.
it.
Okay.
And Also, with the remit of we try to do articles that are a little bit more recent rather than, going back and let's look at some articles from the 60s or something on mans. We try to do things that are a little more recent. Because, spoiler alert, if you read recent articles, they always talk about the old articles at the beginning, and then you don't have to necessarily go read them if you don't have time. Got to min-max that.
Pro tip.
That's a pro. That is a pro tip.
Maybe tell us what articles we're going to talk about today?
No, let's just keep shooting the breeze for a while. Yes, why not?
We have 3 Java articles today.
Java.
It's been a while.
Serious.
It's been a while since we had just Java.
All right, so here's what they are. Evaluation of a vocal mand assessment and vocal mand training procedures by Beret, Vollmer, and Rapp. Quite the crew. From Java, 2004.
I'm not going to lie, when I got assigned this article, I was a bit scared. But it was actually quite delightful.
It was good.
But
it was really good.
I was like,
there was some proportional responding in there. I was like, oh, Jason. Next up, teaching caregivers to implement manned training using speech-generating devices by Suberman and Cividini Mota. That was also in Java 2020. And finally, does teaching an omnibus mand preclude the development of specifying mands? ? By Ward, Hanley, Warner, and Gage. And that was in Java 2021.
Excellent. So we've kind of got 3 different viewpoints of manned training. Well, not viewpoints, I guess, because that would imply that everyone teaches it differently, but 3 different areas in which we're going to be talking about teaching manned. So why don't we start with a quick review of some basic verbal operants, which don't everybody jump up at once.
We all have our finger on our nose here. Yeah, so we're not covering all of verbal behavior in this episode. It would be too much, but we did think it would make sense to just quickly reintroduce for anyone out there the 4 basic verbal operants that Skinner introduces and then defines so that everyone has some level of background. So
let's call them the Fab 4. The Fab 4 verbal operants.
We could do
and
that.
And then I'm going to tell you the 2 that are now on the 5th edition task list
I
that
don't
we
need
did
any
not
of that.
learn.
They didn't exist, exactly.
They
did exist, but
we didn't learn about them. The first time that one of my students brought it up to me, because I don't teach verbal behavior,
Right.
I was like, I actually don't know what that is. And she's like, what? Why are you reading your Cooper book? And I was like, it wasn't in the Cooper book when I had the Cooper book.
I still try to wrap my head around autoclitic every time someone says it. I'm like, wait, okay, it's not an operant exactly. It's part. Yeah.
We're not going to talk about autoclitics today, though. So
thank
I'm
God.
going to talk about these 4 basic ones: manding, tacting, introverbals, and echoics. And I'll tell you what they the way that a layperson would explain them, and then I'll give you a behavioral definition. So first of all, we can talk about
on your construction site when you're talking about verbal behavior.
Well, they all have a counterpart in our day-to-day language. So anyone outside of our field is not going to know what manding or tacting is, right? But manding basically means the same thing as requesting. And we renamed it manding. And the idea there is it's the root word of demand or command, right, is mand. And so with manding, you're basically asking for something else. But when we think about it in terms of antecedent behavior and consequence, then the manding is controlled by some type of EO or AO that's present in the environment that increases the reinforcing properties of the subsequent consequence and the likelihood that behavior will occur. So
hey, Diana, what would it be? What would you say is controlling my behavior if I said I really wish I could see that 3D Disney movie starring Michael Jackson?
It's an EO, Rob.
It's a Captain EO-EO.
It's a Captain EO-EO.
I love Jackie's death stare.
Don't worry, Jackie. I got it. I'm picking up what he's
That's
putting
right. That's for the 80s kids out there.
I'm like, I don't know.
That's killer. That's part of my verbal behavior type 5 right there.
The controlling variables are the EO that's present, and then the listener as well, who can provide the consequence, and the ultimate reinforcer is receiving the thing that's being manded, right? And that's the only one where you actually get something potentially tangible in response to your verbal behavior. All of the other ones are maintained by social praise or interaction, right? Social interaction. So with tacting, wow, people outside of our field call this labeling.
Or naming.
Naming. Oh, well, we have another whole thing about naming, right? Labeling is pretty basic, right? You see something happening and then you say, oh, wow, that's a thing that's happening.
See something,
or
say something.
That's a thing that I can currently see in my field of vision. So in this case, we have something that's present in the physical environment, and it could be visually present. It also could be auditorily present. It could be a smell. And that is what is controlling the response. The verbal response is emitted in the presence of a listener, and then the listener responds with some type of interaction, presumably, and that's what reinforces and maintains the behavior.
They stop naming nuts. Nice. I'm just doing the show for you today, Diana.
I know. That was a best in show reference for anybody else out there. Now, with an introverbal, we have sort of a similar thing happening in that there is nothing received by the speaker, but rather the response is controlled by some aspect of the environment. It may be verbal language that's presented, but there's no additional visual stimulus that's present, right? So maybe you got two speakers, right? So one speaker says something and that then evokes a response on the second speaker, but it's maintained by this social interaction piece. So you could be asking someone like, what's your name? And Rob would say, Rob. I would assume.
We'll see.
Because that's maintained by that type of interaction. It could be something that's specific to you that's controlling the response, right? Like only people named Rob should say Rob when you're asked what's your name. But if I said Old MacDonald had a farm, then most people with a history with respect to that phrase would say E-I-E-I-O in response to it, right? So it could be sort of specific or universal, what maintains that reinforcer.
But if I wanted you to sing Old MacDonald, it would be an E-I-E-O.
Wow.
Yeah?
Yes, exactly. An E-I-E-I-O-E-O. Yes. And then finally...
These are the jokes, folks.
Slaying it.
Again, do not get any of them, but that's okay.
That was not even a movie reference.
That's just Old MacDonald had a farm. E-I-E-I-O. E-O.
Oh, I get it.
Because I asked that.
Okay. I was like, there's too many words and letters. It's too early. What's happening?
I know. Usually we record this like late at night, and now we're trying it in the morning, but now we have like other difficulties. So we're either not up and running yet or we're already winding down. All right. And then finally, I will mention an echoic. With echoic, it's verbal behavior that's controlled by someone else's verbal behavior. But here we have one-to-one correspondence between the two. So basically, it's just an echo, right?
Repeating.
Yes, exactly.
For the layperson.
I say cookie, you say cookie. Cookie. Okay.
But is it echoic if you say potato and I say potato?
No. It wouldn't be because there's not point-to-point correspondence. But I want to also mention...
There might be a little wiggle room.
A little bit, but...
Yeah.
It's an impure echoic.
Oh, lordy.
Which Jackie does not like.
I do also want to say that an echoic is now classified as a duplic. And a duplic is a
Tell me
verbal
why.
operant.
I'm going to say boo.
Duplic is a verbal operant in which the antecedent stimulus and response product form point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity. So examples of duplics are echoics, copying a text, skywriting, finger spelling, and gestural imitation.
Oh, so they just like lump them all together.
Yeah, they lumped it all together.
Because a codic was too easy to remember.
Right. And now
Yes.
a codic is a verbal operant in which the antecedent stimulus and response product form exhibit point-to-point correspondence, but there's no formal similarity, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
like taking dictation, Morse code, textual prompts, those are all examples of codics. So the duplics and codics are now the higher classification of when you have formal similarity or when you have point-to-point correspondence between the antecedent and the response. One has formal similarity, one does not.
Great. I already knew about all those things. I just didn't know those overarching terms.
Yes. And
Okay. I'm not
That
as upset
feels-
now. No, it's fine because before you had to like be like, and here's an example, and here's an example.
Yeah.
These all
Right.
kind of count together, but they're a little bit different. So now there's a
there always was.
classification.
Yes.
Oh, I just never used it before.
Yeah, it was in the verb. It's in the verbal behavior. It's in verbal behavior. Skinner did talk about it, but it wasn't as readily available, I guess. We didn't learn it at all. And again,
Was it a I'm trying to think if that was a chapter because like echoic is a chapter.
It was
chapter in
It was
verbal
part
behavior.
of the echoic chapter.
Okay.
I think it was like very briefly mentioned, but it's there.
I like it actually.
Yeah. So
I don't.
it is on the 5th edition task list. So
I'll survive though.
Okay, great.
Okay.
And So before we launch off into each of these articles, which are all very good, but we're going to have to succinctly summarize these because they're all kind of long as well. I would just want to add that we're kind of focusing this around teaching manding. So I would like to put out there a few recommendations first and foremost on teaching manding. And some of these will maybe get brought up again. But I think that it's important to, if you're teaching someone how to request something, the thing that needs to be controlling that response ultimately is there needs to be an EO present, right? So the response is, the item that's being requested is actually like wanted. And it needs to be in the presence of a listener who can then provide access to that item. So ultimately what you want is not that there's a prompt present in the environment that comes to control responding, but rather the EO is really what evokes the response. So what can end up being a challenge here is if the item is physically present, which sometimes it is, right? But if it's physically present, we can have a hard time knowing if what's controlling the response is actually the EO having the response function as a mand, or if it's the physical presence of the item, which would then have it really function as attacked, right?
Oh my God, Diana. I just realized that almost all of our children's manding behavior is controlled by the fact that you have something. Because if I have something, the kids don't necessarily ask me for it. But if you have something like you made yourself oatmeal or you got yourself a glass of milk, the kids immediately say, oh, can I have some milk? Oh, could I have some oatmeal? Whereas they don't ask for oatmeal if it's not present.
Because you don't know how to make at
I probably punished their request can I have oatmeal? What do you think? I don't know how to do that. Get out of here. Go outside now.
At least you tell them to go outside.
Yes. So between the two of us, I function as an SD for more food, and you really don't.
No, but that means their manding behavior is so well controlled by mom's presence.
Yeah. No.
Oh my goodness.
Probably.
What do they do when they don't live at home and they're adults? They'll never have oatmeal or milk or food. They'll just starve because mom's not there eating it.
How sad.
Well, you also have a different issue when you ask using the SD, like, what do you want?
Yes, exactly.
Right? Because then you don't know. We had this really long discussion at thesis defense the other day. I stumped someone.
Ooh.
Said,
everyone loves being stumped during their thesis defense.
I said, can you give me a novel example of a mand? And she said, if you ask, or even she said, a novel example of attack or man. And she said, what is this? Or what do you want? So then that could either be an interverbal or a mand or attack. Most of the time it's multiply controlled. But I was like, is that?
We did look at, I can't remember if it was a grab bag or one of our other episodes where we talked about mands. We did look at what do you want as a prompt and whether we should be quite so worried. And I think not the consensus, but I think research is pointing mostly to it's probably okay if you're throwing out some what do you wants in your training procedure, though you should do your due diligence and then ensure that the mand is not actually controlled by the what do you want as much as by the presence of an adult.
Has, I think, sort of a real life implication in that if someone is only used to telling you what they want after you say, what do you want? Then that could limit their opportunities to really make their wants and needs known.
Yes.
Right? So they're in some of these cases, it's just like, oh, we're just splitting hairs, semantically in order to ensure that our research is pure, which is important for research, but less important for teaching. But in that case, I do think, depending on the learner, that could actually be something you want to make sure isn't happening so that their voice really is being heard.
I love the restaurants where they're all about pure ordering and they just don't even come out to take your order. They just wait for you to just mand into space.
That's right. Yeah.
Like, I'd love a burger. And then they come over. And
right. And if you read it off the menu, then, maybe it was just a textual response.
No, they don't give you anything. They just want to make sure. Right. They really care about the pureness of mands at these restaurants.
But when you see like those delicious desserts going by to someone else's table and you're like, I want that. Who knows, right? Who knows? What have you done? Have you tacted it? Have you manded for it?
I guess you could tell. I would guess it's probably a mand versus the tact of I want that.
I think so too. So it's potentially multiply controlled.
I know that's the form.
So that's all. I just wanted to present those things initially to get people like thinking about what it actually means to teach manding. And now we can hop into our articles, right?
All right.
Okay, so my article was the Bourret article, and it looking at establishing a vocal mand assessment. And I never even thought about this when I was reading the introduction, that there's like a lot of studies that teach mands and teach man training, but did not actually specify their man training protocol.
Yeah.
And it leaves it unclear whether it would work for any learner or if it works for a specific learner because they have some prerequisites or they've already have some manding in their repertoire. My mind was blown.
I felt similarly about this article, Jackie, and I didn't have time to sort of do a really deep dive to see, the citation review, but this felt very much like this is a great idea. I'm hoping that a lot of people have reviewed this, but looking at the date, when it was originally, it's a 2004 article, I don't see a lot of reference.
No.
I'm wondering, was this just sort of something that like Jason and colleagues worked on and then they moved on to something different and they never came back to it and it sort of just hasn't been as reviewed, or maybe some parts have been taken out.
Yeah,
but it felt like we should be seeing so much more like this. And I mean, perhaps it's out there. Maybe it's an analysis of verbal behavior. I don't know. I don't read that journal quite as much. So
I agree. I was like, why? Number one, why haven't I read this article yet in my life? Because I love it.
Yeah, it's a good article.
And we see Jason, and he usually throws his articles at us and says, read this one now.
He does not.
No, he does not.
That would be amazing. He drives by our house, rolls his window down, is like, here's a new one. Here's one from the Wayback Time Machine.
Like a paper boy?
Yeah. Just throws his articles out. That would be awesome. You ever want to read journal articles? Sure, we all do. Why don't you sign up for the paper boy of journal articles? Every morning you'll get a new journal
curated. Just for you.
Unrelated. Well, related to someone did mention that they were looking into the Regis program because they heard the ad on the podcast and they were like, you know what? I should check out that program.
That's awesome. Sure, we all do. We do need to actually update that because it's very old.
The sound quality is, every time I hear it, I'm like, we got to re-record. They're like, that was okay, one mic back in the day.
It was up in the dining room. So sometimes man training is also described as functional communication training, which makes sense, right? Because it would specify that reinforcer, and they use that for the treatment of problem behavior, but it doesn't necessarily, again, specify how you're teaching the mand. And so they say that one of the considerations that practitioners should look for when they are designing a mand program is who the audience is going to be. And I agree right there, right? Because you need to have the audience in order to gain access to the reinforcer. But I'd also like to add here that participant preference should be at the forefront. And in 2004, they weren't talking about that, right? But I think now that should also be, that should be one of our top priorities. So if a participant doesn't enjoy speaking vocally and enjoys using the AAC device, then that is now an appropriate measure, right? So they say we should focus on we're going to be focusing on verbal training here because it's the most easiest understood, right? Not everybody knows sign language, but now with the emergence of AAC devices, they're very recognizable now. And
technologically a lot of advances have been made. Yeah.
So I just wanted to put that caveat in. No fault of these researchers in 2004. That wasn't a thing, but I think now if you're reading it, you should be thinking about how the student best talks. And I also want to say again, because I always say it, that just because you're using AAC does not mean that you're also not working on language, right? We've seen time and time again in speech.
And no, you're not verbal.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Because any of those forms of communication are valid.
Yes. And I'm just saying that shouldn't, it shouldn't be like, I just want my kid to talk, right? There's many ways that you can talk and communicate.
Yes.
So a lot of the times the authors say that students that are coming into man training because they're not asking for things that they want, and they say, okay, there might be some reasons why. Maybe the things that you have are not reinforcing. Maybe they've never been taught how to say that. Maybe they've come under very unusual control, like Diana in the presence of food. So they never ask for food except for in the presence of Diana. They say that maybe that rarely contacts reinforcement, so they might ask for it, but then maybe it's not delivered. And then the final one is that prompts may occasion responding. And there's 5 there, I think, right? I can't really count right now because my brain. But if you wouldn't be able to use one strategy to teach all of those issues, right? So that's kind of where they're coming at of this study. So the purpose of the study was to develop a mand assessment and then test it out with treatment. So I love this. They do recommend that should be part of a larger assessment. This shouldn't be the only assessment, which I love, right? They're like, just so you know,
got to cover those bases.
Yeah. So the first study is designed to figure out when vocal mands do and do not occur. And the second part of the study is to develop the treatment. So they have 3 participants, 3 boys, all have a diagnosis of autism. 6-year-old Will, 14-year-old Mike, 18-year-old Nick. The assessment was conducted 3 to 5 days per week, 1 to 3 sessions per day, 10 minutes in length, and they conducted the sessions outside of their regular classroom in various places. So the first thing that they did is they figured out what tangible items and edible items would function as reinforcers potentially. So they did some previous preference assessments were used. They had free operants with 5 to 8 stimuli. And for Will, they had a tangible and edible preference assessment separate, right? So what they did is once they identified the highest preferred items on the preference assessment, they met with the caregivers to identify an appropriate vocal response for each of those. And so then they based what they were going to target on the preference assessment, the clarity of the response. So couldn't anyone outside of, who's closest to these participants understand what they were asking for, not just their parents, and ease of pronunciation. So what they found, they focused on chip for Will. If he said chip, he got chips. Mike, they focused on the word tunes. If he said tunes, he got a radio, which is so amazing because who uses radios now? And Nick, he had to say radio. So the assessment started and then followed the most lovely, lovely flow chart in figure 1.
I did admire that flow chart.
Yeah.
So good. So the beginning of the trial, they waited 10 seconds. If the response occurred, they said chip in the presence of chip. Then they got to access the reinforcer until the end of the 1 minute. So if they...
Such a cool way to do it.
Right? So if you said it early on, you just get chips for a whole minute. This is like my dream. Right? But if you wait, then they would give a non-specific prompt like, if you want this, you can just tell me what it is. And then if they got it, then they got the reinforcer. If not, then they said, if you want chips, you can say, I want chips. So that was a model prompt. And then they waited again 10 seconds. And then the next prompt was a phenom. I can never say that word. Phoneme prompt, which was like, if you want this, you can say ch. And so they were looking for a partial utterance here. So partial utterances were...
This is a digraph.
Yeah.
CH.
Oh, yeah. The partial utterance was only accepted here at the end.
Yeah.
So everything else had to be a full utterance. And then if they did it, they got the edible quickly, probably because the minute's almost over. Mm-hmm. And if they didn't, they just started the trial again.
Yeah. What a great way to build in differential quality or quantity of reinforcement into your design.
And one thing I love was that then they said that they, give you the flowchart and then they explained why they put the prompts in the specific order. I loved that.
That's great.
So they waited the 10 seconds, obviously, to get unprompted responding. And if you didn't get unprompted responding, you wanted to see if you didn't need modeling, right? If you could just give that general non-specific prompt and then responding would occur. The third one was to gain access. The third one with the model prompt was, okay, do you need modeling in order to then access the reinforcer? And then following that, they wanted to see if you could just engage in any sort of responding. And if you needed that partial utterance, maybe shaping would be the best model for you, or the best type of prompting for you. So they said the longer you have to go through the assessment, the more intense the treatment may need to be, which is helpful for clinicians.
Yeah.
And they scored both full and partial utterances. And that's what the graphs look at. And the graphs are lovely too.
They are.
So everything is basically lovely. And so in figure 2, they looked at Will, and Will has 2 graphs because they graph partial utterances and full utterances differently, right? So he did really well with the partial utterances, but then dropped off because at session 8, he started engaging in full utterances in that non-specific, using the model. And so exposure to prompts and reinforcement might be enough for Will to teach MANS, and so they're going to assess that in the treatment session. Mike never had any full utterances observed, so they didn't have a graph for him for full utterances. And for him, he only responded in the phoneme. Thank you. I'm just going to keep saying phoneme because I like it better.
That's a different thing.
The phoneme prompt.
Sound very fancy.
It was about a tennis star.
I do remember that show.
Time ago.
I don't.
I don't know that it was very good.
Not really.
Man, I would do horrible at a get-together party talking about old movies and TV shows, unless it was like Anna Green Gables or
Oh, with Megan Fallows?
yeah, obviously.
It's on the Disney Channel. And Colleen Dewhurst?
Yeah. Ooh.
Wow.
Rob, you just moved up in my.
And a small role with Kids in the Hall star Bruce McCullough.
You know what? I liked you before, but now I really like you. I went there, by the way.
To Prince Edward
Prince Edward
Island?
and I saw the house.
Wow.
Yeah, one of my old boyfriends brought me. It was like so romantic. Anyway, so Mike only engaged in that.
Then you got
final
scarlet fever inside.
No, I just administered Epicac. That's amazing. Mike only engaged in the final prompt, the third prompt. And so they thought that shaping would be the best for him. And finally with Nick didn't need partial utterances. He always engaged in fertile utterances. So he only engaged in responses following any of the prompts. So they figured that prompt fading was the treatment for him.
Yeah, because they said he had a large verbal repertoire. He just didn't
do it.
Or vocal verbal repertoire, I should say. He just didn't use it independently.
All right. So for study 2, one thing I love about study 2 is they're like, even though we're doing 3 different participants, we want to show experimental control with all of them. Like, of course you do. Of course you do. So with Will, they taught 2 new responses, music and video, music for the radio, video for a clip. I love it that it was probably on a VCS, like a VHS tape.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. Right? And so during baseline, both of the items were in view, but there was no prompting or reinforcement. During treatment, they used the same strategies as the assessment, and they did a multiple baseline across behaviors design. Will never said either word in baseline, but in treatment, he demonstrated that the new words could be learned in the absence of prompting because they just used the model. So the model was the prompt, but they didn't have to then do anything else. So the model prompt was needed in the early stages, but then behavior contacted the contingencies and then occurred independently. So they're like, yay, awesome. For Mike, they used prompts for successive approximation of the mand. So the word tunes they used because he never learned it. And so they did a variation of a changing criterion design for him. So for his, I kind of love this. They started off with just requiring t. And then once that was mastered, t, then tune, and then tunes. Right? And they have the graph and it shows the response for each of the approximations, whereas when one is trained, the other ones start going on extinction.
Yeah, it's a really neat graph the way they've
beautiful.
shown it.
Yeah. And so what they said, sadly, he did learn how to say tunes, which he had never done before, but prompts were never eliminated from the teaching session. So that was a limitation for him. For Nick, they used a prompt fading procedure. So the assessment was the first 6 sessions and they added one on. So they faded out prompts. This one was kind of hard for me to understand because they said that if the prompt was, Nick, if you want to say this, then if you want this, then say. But then they faded it all the way back to just saying Nick. That was confusing to me. Like, they didn't say all the end of the stuff.
Right.
They just said Nick. That seems like a huge jump.
It seems like he had a fair amount of prompt dependence.
Right.
Right? And so any sort of initial SD on the part of the experimenter would then prompt the response.
Yes. So that's what it was. But for me, I was like, whoa. And I had to read that section a few times because I was like, wait. They went all the way back.
Yeah.
But they did. So they did a prompt fade Nick, and they saw unprompted responses. And then they did a prompt fade N, and they saw unprompted responses. And that was for the radio. And for the Play-Doh, actually, they just used the model prompt, and that increased the unprompted responses. So for him, he didn't need that for the model prompt. Yeah, so there was really dramatic increases for language. They said that with Mike, it might take a long time to teach just one word, right? They did a lot of sessions. But 2 participants started speaking more. They hypothesized that Nick had a behavioral cusp because once he started this, he had the language but wasn't using it, but now he was using it. And they said that they didn't compare the treatments or others of training these specific words. But I don't think they needed to. I think that was probably like a review or 2 thing, right? Because they saw that it was effective. So cool article.
I'm just so surprised that, I mean, and maybe it's out there and someone will email and say, yeah, we use this all the time at our clinic, or, oh yeah, there's a bunch of iterations of this, but it just felt like a neat kind of quick tool that you could use as part of your, initial intake for, man training or, when you're trying to increase overall vocalizations. And I'd never really seen it in action. And
I haven't either.
I'd love to see kind of more with this. I mean, maybe something else kind of captures this and is part of another assessment that I'm not aware of, but who knows? If you know, please let us know. All right. Well, thanks, Jackie. Before we take our break, I want to leave our listeners with a quick question that came up while we were discussing this article. I had a quick question. We're talking about, because you always need some sort of a reinforcer to usually tangible when you're starting out with man training. And we talked about chips and radio. And we talked, the different qualities of reinforcers. Sometimes you're going to have a higher quantity, but sometimes you have a different magnitude. And I was thinking, well, magnitude makes sense for something like the radio. Turn up the volume, right? As Christian Slater would tell us. But for chips, could you increase the magnitude of chips? I have a thought, but I want our listeners to think about that while we take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Okay.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking about teaching mans. But before we continue on with our articles and the answer to that head scratcher of a question that I left you all with, I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. And by listening, you can earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click the link in your notes, the notes section of your podcast player to go directly there and enter in some information, including 2 secret code words. Luckily, we have lots of new secret code words because all of our stuff got moved around. And so lots of things that we didn't see are now in front of us again.
Because that's how we go with code words. We tacked.
Yes, we did a lot of tacting. And the first of those code words is fiasco. F-A-I-S-C-O, usually in reference to something that has gone just terribly, terribly wrong. But in this case was a tact of the RPG storytelling game Fiasco, which I remember we got to play on my birthday one year. We haven't played it since, but it was a lot of fun.
I actually don't remember that game.
Oh, you make like a crime?
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, you have to make like a crime and everyone's got like a part to play.
Yep.
Yeah?
I remember.
Not your
I
favorite?
don't know what I was doing.
You were playing.
Was I there?
Yeah.
Yep. You were playing because I was playing.
Okay.
Oh, it was a lot. I remember it being a lot of fun.
It was so much fun.
Fiasco.
Great.
All right.
All right.
So we left really quickly with, can you increase or change the magnitude of chips?
All right. I'm ready to answer.
Oh, you're ready to answer. Okay.
Beep, 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 beep.
I thought you were just going to go right to your article and pretend I had not asked the question. Okay, go for it.
Yes, Rob, you could increase the magnitude of chips. For example, this hierarchy: tortilla chips, cheese, nacho cheese Doritos,
Taquitos.
spicy sweet chili Doritos, Cool Ranch Doritos.
Okay,
What about
there you go.
taquitos?
I don't know those.
They're a type of chip, right?
They're the highest chip.
Oh, well, see, I was thinking that this wouldn't really be up for debate because clearly the hierarchy I just established is correct.
Yes.
But maybe it's idiosyncratic.
People will write out. I don't even like taquitos, but because I can't do the spicy chips.
They like the roll-up ones?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
People fucking love them.
There's not a lot of surface area though. I feel like the magnitude has to do with how much like flavored dust has been placed upon your chip.
A lot.
Yeah. Oh, if there's a lot.
Taquitos.
If there's a lot.
Oh, okay. So is that what you were going for?
I'm thinking like extreme goldfish, that
it's
cheddar blasted.
It's only flavor.
Okay.
There's like so little chip and only flavor.
Okay.
Or like when you get the Dorito out and it's like, dear God, it's like it's full of stars and there's just like nothing but like dots of flavor dust. Like that's a high magnitude
I see.
chip.
Okay.
That's what I was thinking too, Diana. Thank you for playing along.
You're welcome. Not that we're recommending that you need to use edibles as reinforcers.
No, I'm just it's a hypothetical.
I know. Okay.
Let's talk about speech generating devices
I will
and
do
man
that
training,
now.
shall
And
we?
I just would like to note that we've also had Dr. Sivadini Mota on the show in the past.
Jeez, humble brag.
No, I'm bringing it up because we just talked about prompt dependence, and that was what she came on to talk about. So I wanted to give that shout out there because she kind of interacts with this material in multiple ways. So this article was looking at teaching caregivers to implement man training using speech generating devices. And it was a much more recent article. And that's probably why we get this type of introduction that we do, which I fully support. It talks about how not everyone communicates vocally. There are many different ways to communicate. And one of those ways is using AAC, which is augmentative and adapted communication. And one example of that is an SGD, which is a speech generating device. And then, of course, there are many examples of that. But this is, putting it out there that you don't need to use verbal speech to functionally communicate. And they wanted to make sure that we had literature on how one might help. It says caregivers. They were all parents. Help parents to teach manding at home if their child uses an SGD. And they said there's some research that's looked at this previously. Two examples were Hong et al. 2014 and Sigfus et al. 2004. And then there's also been a few others out there that were using PECs rather than an SGD. So if anyone wants to find those and learn more about it, if this is relevant for your clinical population, then you should totally do that. And then in this study, not unlike previous studies, how did they do that parent training? Give me a B. B. Give me an S.
S.
Give me a T.
T.
What does that stand for?
Behavior skills training.
Great. We did not rehearse that ahead of time, so that was pretty darn good. So yeah, they used behavior skills training to teach parents how to do this thing. And to do that, they had 3 parent or caregiver child dyads.
Sounds like that's the book. Yeah. BST, to teach a thing.
Basically, to give some demographic data, all the caregivers were actually moms aged 35 to 42 who had at least a bachelor's degree, and all children were diagnosed on the spectrum, communicated via an SGD. And in this case, for all of them, it was an iPad that had Proloquo to Go on it. One of them was a girl aged 9, and 2 of them were boys aged 10 and 12.
I'm sorry, listeners. I just want everyone to know that while Diana joked about how we had not trained that, in her notes for the article, she wrote B exclamation mark, S exclamation mark, T exclamation mark.
I did.
So while Jackie and I were not prepared for that, she was.
Well, you guys were fairly quick to catch on. All right, so our primary dependent variable was the percentage of steps implemented correctly on the caregiver TA for teaching manding via speech generating device. And they modified that from a TA that was in King et al. 2014 to do something quite similar for teaching PECs use. The way this was structured was each session had 5 trials where the parent was going to provide an opportunity for manding and then help the child, prompt them through the process as much as is needed. So that happened 5 times. And the mastery criterion for behavior skills training was 90% for one session, which was the 5 trials. And then they had a secondary dependent variable they were also measuring, which was the number of mans that were omitted in these pre- and post-training structured observation sessions that occurred between the caregiver and the child. And in these, they provided at least 10 opportunities to mand. So either it was like a combination of 10 a combination of independent mans, prompted mans, or at least opportunities to mand to equal 10 total times that it either occurred or could have occurred, basically. And I guess I should give you the definitions for that. So an independent mand was the child selected the correct icon on their device within 5 seconds with no prompt. A prompted mand was they selected the correct icon, but there was prompting involved. And then an error could have been either an error of omission, a clear opportunity to mand was presented, but the child did not engage, or an error of commission. For example, one of the participants pressed the button repeatedly and didn't wait for a response, so they felt like that wasn't really functioning as a mand for them. So all of those were measured. So those structured observations happened at the beginning and the end, but a lot of other stuff happened in the middle. I will also let you know that IOA looked pretty good, and PI was 100%. They did do a social validity study. They included that in the study. It was given to parents at the end. I liked this. They sent it to them via snail mail, and they could send it back they included like a self-addressed stamped envelope, but this way they could ensure that it was anonymous, which I thought was kind of nice. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So the design was a non-concurrent multiple baseline across participants, and then they had those generalization probes in there too. They first did a preference assessment for preferred items for each of the children. For 2 of them, they did use edibles as the main reinforcer, and for 1 of them, they used leisure items. And then in the structured observation, they told parents, just respond as you normally would. And they had an item from the preference assessment that was replaced within eyesight of the child, but out of their reach. The speech generating device was available at the ready. And if the child manded for the item, then they got it. And if they managed to get to the item without manding, they also got it, which is totally fair, right? Like that's just a lost opportunity, but we're not going to like wrestle it away.
Nothing
Let's
is
not
a
do that.
barrier to mand training like free access to item.
Yes. Okay, so that was kind of like the pre-post, right? But then in between, they needed to teach the parents how to actually do the mand training. So in the baseline for the study, for the primary dependent variable, was the parent was shown the checklist with all the steps for the manding process, and they had a list of the child's preferred items, and then they took those away. But they did see them first, right? Because that's a good measure of baseline, that they at least had a clue of what they should be doing. And then the caregiver was instructed to just demonstrate how they would encourage the child to request the preferred item with the SGD. And there was no other feedback provided. And then if the parent did not perform to mastery level, which these 3 dyads did not, then they implemented BST. So they broke the checklist down into kind of 3 pieces, and they taught them sequentially. So they first worked on the level 1 part, and then the level 2, and then the level 3. And for the BST, they were given a copy of the checklist. Then it was modeled with a variety of potential child responses. So it wasn't just and then your child will do exactly what we are anticipating. Like they did plan ahead for that. Like what if they don't respond right away, or they pick the wrong icon, or they try to take the item, etc. So I did like that. They did basically multiple exemplar training within the BST. And then they did role play with the training assistant with, again, various child scripts, and provided feedback on the parent's behavior as needed. During this modeling and role play part, the researcher modeled 5 trials, and then the caregiver practiced 5 trials. And then after that, they did the BST assessment, which was basically just the role play part without the modeling. So they just did the 5 trials of the role play to see how they did without an immediate preceding model. And then they did a post BST assessment. These were with the child present. If they reached 90%, then they were all set. If they didn't, they did a booster session, and then they did the assessment again after the booster session. And then they did a generalization probe, which was 1 week later in a novel setting. And then they did the structured observation again, which, remember, was just find 10 opportunities, that one. So they did all of those things. So it was quite involved, which did then, when we get to the results, make the figure a little bit confusing, to be honest. Yeah. But only because they were trying to fit it all into the one graph, and they succeeded. The figure makes sense. It just takes you kind of a minute to get through what happened.
It's not like a quick glance.
Yeah.
Not really. So it's got two y-axes, one for the caregiver and one for the child, and one of them is measuring the primary DV, which was percent of steps of the checklist completed independently. And then the second y-axis was for the child, and it was measuring number of requests that occurred. But once you like sort through all of that, you're okay. They also did give us how long the caregiver spent in BST, which is nice because it lets you know sort of the resources that are required. So the caregiver spent between 115 and 210 minutes total in BST, which works out to 2 to 3.5 hours. So it's not super duper long, but it is, it would be a few sessions of parent training if you wanted to do this on your own. Mm-hmm. And so then the results for, I'm sorry, I didn't say all the caregivers learned all the components of the checklist, right?
Yeah.
So that happened. We don't need to worry about that. Just as in every other demonstration of BST works, period, right? You might need to spend a long time. You might need to go back and forth a little bit with the boosters, but it will get you there. For the child, and remember, this was like our secondary dependent variable, but honestly, it could have been the primary one because they demonstrated really nice control with this as well. So for child 1, the manding in their initial structured observation went from 40% of independent mans and then all of the opportunities to 80% in the post-BST opportunities. Child number 2, that level of independent manding changed from 10% in pre to 90% in post. And then unfortunately for child 3, they didn't get the follow-up post. They didn't have the opportunity to do the structured observation. So we can't speak to what happened there. We know that initially it was only at 10%. And then in the generalization probes, it did increase. But we don't have that same type of post structured observation session to compare. So this was very wildly successful, right? This was building upon previous research by Rosales that had done the same thing. I think I have that right. I didn't write it down. Yeah, Rosales 2009, that they had done not with an SGD. So this was an expansion on that, and it was obviously successful. All they were changing was the topography of the mand, right? From a vocal response to a speech-generated device response. So we would expect to see that type of generality, and they got it, but now it's on paper. Limitations they wanted to make sure were mentioned was that a verbal prompt such as, if you want something, let me know, was used in the structured observation session, and that wasn't used in the training sessions. So just putting it out there that could have been a potential variable that may have attributed to control of the response in that setting, which is why we also brought it up as a potential limitation. And then they also noted that for some reason that was not gone into, children 2 and 3 had aggression during their sessions. And I don't think this was uncommon for these participants. It was probably being targeted in other ways at other times. But they said, if this is a potential to occur, we should probably give the parents guidelines for how to address it. And they hadn't done that here. It was, it was safe, I believe, the whole time, but they didn't give that specifically. So moving forward, that is a good recommendation. All right. And that's how you teach parents to help teach manding. Cool.
All right. Specifically with a speech generating
Specifically,
device.
but it wouldn't. It
would be the same.
Ways. Yeah.
Just add the device or don't have the device depending on whether it's a vocal or non-vocal learner. All right. Well, let's wrap it up with one more article, Ward and colleagues in 2021, which is not exactly a manned training article in the way I think we've sort of been talking about it, but it does ask and answer a question regarding, I think, one of the more commonly used practices in manned training, which is through specifically FCT. So functional communication in the area of decreasing severe problem behavior or replacing severe problem behavior with communication. And many of you probably know, especially folks who have been in the field for a shorter amount of time, that it sort of seems like a no-brainer these days of like, oh, you do your assessment and then you get your condition, whether you're using, it's an analog FA or more likely something like an ISCA, and then you have your functional communication. And rather than teaching individual mans, what if we just use one mand that rules them all, that omnibus mand, and that will be the mand that just gets the child back to all aspects of reinforcement. So this synthesized reinforcement condition, and in that way, we can see a significant decrease in problem behavior. We don't have to teach individual mans, which we know can take time. We don't have to worry about multiply controlled problem behavior because guess what? There's no need to have problem behavior when all the reinforcement reinforcers magically reappear when you use the one phrase, usually something like my way.
And I can say, the omnibus ban, I like the idea of it, but it's not always what you should do.
No.
Right? I just want to put that out there because people are like, we should always use the omnibus ban. I don't agree with that. I don't think you should always do anything. Right?
Yes, you should never always do anything.
Never always. Always, never always, actually.
Yes. But so I think in some cases it is helpful, but if you don't know all of the maintaining variables, the omnibus ban is not going to help you. Right? Because then they're not going to be accessing the reinforcer, but asking exactly what they want. So I've seen it, right? And if you're throwing everything out them, but you've missed this one thing,
then you've done a bad assessment.
You've done a bad assessment, but that happens.
Well, that's why you do an assessment before you would throw an omnibus man in place. And there's some recommendations around when you might want to think of an omnibus man versus not. And for the rest of this article, I'm going to be using my preferred phrase for an omnibus man, which is the ombudsmand, which I just like to say. So I'll be saying that. If you would like to say that too and make it something in the parlance, just among us behavior analyst friends, then I'd appreciate that too. It's always fun to see if you can throw something into the lexicon. So really, Ward and colleagues are going to answer that question because there is always that concern. Yeah, but you taught my way, or you taught whatever the child's omnibus man is, some sort of a sign. Usually it's a new response for the child. And yeah, we know there's a lot of literature supporting that this can significantly decrease rates of problem behavior. But what's going to happen later when you've taught them this omnibus man that leads to synthesized reinforcement? What if the EO changes for any aspect of that synthesized reinforcement? What if you then decided, all right, we know that they love it when they say my way and they get their iPad and they get their flavor blasted goldfish and the adult comes over and sits with them and a different movie is playing on the TV in the background. But what would happen if I just took out one part of that? Wouldn't the child just keep saying my way, my way, my way, my way for every single possible iteration of communication? What if we then tried to teach them, no, you can just ask for television or flavor blasted goldfish as sort of a separate occurrence? Would we see a resurgence of problem behavior because technically we'd be putting at least a component of that my way man under extinction? So would we see problem behavior occur? Because ideally, we would like to move children on to more and more precise mans because that motivation is going to change. And if they just want some goldfish while they're sitting and doing work, well, we could give them some goldfish while they're sitting and doing work. It's not the same as returning to the complete synthesized reinforcement condition. So what do we do there? Do we know what will happen? Will it be a disaster? Are we teaching a generation of children an ombudsman that then leads them to never use any other phrase in the future when we try to do other more precise manned training? And that is a question that's gone on for a while. So this paper hopes to answer that question.
Good job, Shannon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was Shannon's supervisor, by the way. A long time ago.
Long time ago. There's some other possible downsides to the ombudsman, which is that a novel listener might not know what to do. So the child uses this new sign, which leads back to all their synthesized reinforcers, and they don't know what to. Oh, you want like a glass of water? I'll give you one thing. But again, based on the treatment, you're trying to create that synthesized reinforcement condition. So just giving one component of it may not effectively decrease rates of problem behavior or may lead to problem behavior, the kind of resurgence of problem behavior.
I was just going to say, I feel like right now is a very stressful time in all of our lives currently because it's the end of the semester. Mm-hmm. And there are many, like there is an ideal scenario that I would like to find myself in where I have no responsibilities and I'm on the couch and I'm snuggled up in a blanket and I have my favorite TV show on and I'm drinking my favorite tea.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But I take even a portion of that.
Yeah, one
right
of
now,
those things.
Right? Exactly.
Except
so, like,
just the tea. I would want something more than
yeah,
just
the tea. I'm still accessing, but all the other things not really. So, although I would like to request the works, if I could like pare it down and identify even just the one thing that would make my life a little bit better right now, I would also request that one thing. So I think that it is a useful skill
to ask for a thing.
A thing. Yes.
Oh, yes. And I think everyone would agree. But again, one of the reasons that often we're seeing more and more individuals starting with the ombudsman is because you don't need to worry about, am I just capturing a component of what is maintaining this problem behavior? There's also that reality that sometimes you do have that synthesized EO that's evoking problem behavior, and just teaching one specific man won't really move the needle in terms of decreasing problem behavior. Plus, it's easier.
Right, and it's the perfect place to start.
Yeah. Well, it's easier for the learner, I should say, not just easier for us clinicians.
Right.
It's easier for the learner.
Yes.
It may also be easier for the clinician, but really the goal is easier for the learner. There's not much response effort. You don't need to ask for 10 different things in a chain of behavior. You can just get it all, one-stop shop, one-stop man shop. So here's the question. What happens if we teach the ombudsman and then teach specific mans? Will the children lose it? Will the children learn it? Let's find out, shall we? So the study here looked at 3 children in an ABA school. It was Raj, Cole, and Lee, different ages from 5 to 10. They all had multiple problem behaviors like aggression, self-injurious behavior, often happening at times like preferred items ending, adults not complying with their mans when they were given work to do. Raj used a speech-generating device. The other two, Lee used a speech-generating device, and then Cole was a verbal communicator. They kind of had similar-ish topographies of problem behavior, similar-ish evocative kind of demand and denial of manned and denied access problem behavior. All 3 had an interview and an ISCA, so the practical functional assessment process to see what are the controlling variables of problem behavior. There were some components in this study where they referred to some other techniques used, but I think that had more to do with the fact that they were also part of a different research study at the same time. So they just sort of had mentioned it in there. I don't think it's relevant to our discussion of man training necessarily. So within the context of the ISCA, you found that Raj really wanted to escape from demands, access tangibles, have social attention, have adults comply with playmans. So he was given the ombudsman of a modified sign, thumb toward chest, or a vocal approximation of my way. Cole liked to escape from demands, liked access to tangibles, liked access to adult compliance with mans. So his ombudsman was my way, please. And then Lee liked to escape from demands. He did not like when adults had diverted their attention. So usually the escape from demand was paired with that diverted adult attention. He liked access to tangibles. He liked access to attention as well. So his ombudsman was pressing a button on his speech generating device to say my way. So again, this probably points out one of the strengths and weaknesses of the ombudsman, which is like, why'd you even do an assessment? You could have just assumed that everybody likes all the things and gone from there. It's a little more fine-grained. It's a lot more fine-grained than that when we talk about assessments and knowing what are your relevant evocative situations. But again, in this case, all 3 kind of had almost the same situations.
Which is also my situation.
Yes, which is also Diana's situation. Although Diana's not engaging in severe problem behavior, so you could probably hedge your bets and just try the precise
I am keeping
instruction
myself
of mans.
safe.
Good for you. So all of them were taught how to initiate, to use their man, obtain therapist attention, and then emit their man, which was like tapping a shoulder, saying excuse me, or using the speech generating device to say excuse me, and then using either their device or vocal communication to say my way, or for example of Raj using his modified sign. So after the man's training, we'll get into the man training, they did need to then teach specific mans or specifying mans for each of these sorts of categories of reinforcer within the blob of synthesized reinforcement. So they had to say, okay, what are these going to look like? So for Raj, they wanted him to have an all-done response, which was, again, a sign or verbal approximation, a way to say stuff, so to get access to the items, so again, a sign or verbal approximation, and then to get attention, play with me, a sign or verbal approximation.
I just looked up what the ASL sign for stuff was because I didn't know. Mm-hmm. So it's like you hold your hand like straight out, like with your palm up, and then you just move it over to the right a little bit. So it's like stuff. Yeah,
like the hand motion that everybody makes when they're talking about stuff.
Exactly. Yes.
Oh, wow. That's a good one.
So I just wanted everyone to know in case you didn't know that.
Very nice. For Cole, he learned the target specifying mans were I want to stop working, I want whatever he wants, and then specific mans for compliance. Please stop talking and come and watch this.
Both very useful.
Yeah, very good ones. And then for Lee, his speech generating device, and we'll talk a little bit more about the details of this because I found this to be just awesome in terms of using technology in a really efficient way, were buttons for I want to take a break, can we hang out, I want bubbles, and can I have my Kindle, and I want a snack. So again, specifying a lot of different tangible items.
Awesome.
So again, the goal here is first teach the ombudsman, then teach the specifying mans one at a time. There's a multiple baseline across the different specifying mans for the different reinforcement classes. So they weren't necessarily breaking out, I want bubbles, can I have my Kindle, because those would be the same class. within the same class. So all three had an ISCA. Two of them did a progressive extinction analysis where they sort of looked at each topography of problem behavior, where they'd put each component sequentially placed on extinction to see if the different topographies were controlled by that same synthesized reinforcement contingency. I believe that had something to do with a different study, which might have been a study we talked about in the past because that sounds so familiar, but I could not remember which one it was. And then in baseline, they just took the end of those last ISCA sessions to use as a baseline, which is always the really nice and efficient way to get started with your treatment. Then they teach the general functional communication training, where they teach the ombudsman to access all the reinforcers just by using prompting, using differential reinforcement. They do progressive evocative situations, which is pretty much the equivalent of, I'm sure a lot of you do this and you've never referred to it as, I'm doing progressive evocative situations, in which you're like, what if instead of just, give me all the toys and here's the work I'm throwing at you and I'm ignoring you now, what if I kind of did it a piece at a time and just kept signaling, look, it's getting worse. Don't you want to use that mand? Is pretty much what it looks like, the equivalent. So for example, for Raj, first reach for the toys, then start touching the toys, then stop following his mands, then start presenting demands, then start putting the items somewhere away, then started kind of diverting your attention more, then start presenting even more work. So
increasing the EO.
Exactly. Which again, I never really thought of calling it anything fancy, but that's what you're doing. And I think when you explain it to folks, they get that they're doing something rather than just we're going from synthesized reinforcement to synthesized EO in a split second, which, again, you're usually not doing that anyway, but knowing you're doing it sort of as a progression to see if you can evoke the communication. Mm-hmm. So again, everyone learned their my way or whatever their equivalent response was. Then they learned their initiating response, a kind of excuse me. Then they would start sequentially teaching each reinforcer in that synthesized reinforcer class. So within the session, they just kind of keep presenting evocative antecedents, and then they sort of prompt the mands. If the child used the specifying mand for the kind of evocative antecedent that was being presented, they get 30 seconds of reinforcement. The other reinforcement was still available, so it was just removing kind of one piece at a time. If they had problem behavior, they would prompt the expected communication response using a physical, vocal, gestural kind of 3-step hierarchy, and they'd use a time delay as well to sort of move their prompts out based on kind of successful responses. So gradually they'd change the evocative conditions to look more like their natural environment. So the classroom they were in, which again got harder because there's more they have to sort of juggle. And then they'd sort of, how they broke that down was different for each one. I'm going to give the example of Raj, though they all looked similar to this, just some of the details are different. So for example, for Raj, he had his manual sign or his vocal response. So they teach us 3 specifying mands. They started with escape. So after he said, my way, the researcher would say, sure, you can have my way. What do you want? Or signed my way. They'd say, what do you want? They then prompt him to say, all done. And then they just remove the work. And they'd also return all the other reinforcers. So they were just kind of removing one part at a time. After he'd mastered the use of all done or his all done sign, they'd add stuff. So they'd add, what else do you want? And then they'd sort of wait for him to say what he wanted. Then they return all his stuff to him, all his tangibles. And then finally they taught play with me, in which they would then kind of return their adult attention or mand compliance to the situation. So again, after they did all that, they'd start, they'd do more phases where they'd remove all the adult cues. Though again, sure, what do you want? They kept after the ombudsman, just because that is a pretty natural response to, I just want to do it my way. Okay, well, like, what do you mean by your way? So that prompt did sort of remain throughout. So again, it was very similar to the other 2 participants. They had different numbers of man, so kind of that chain of events and that chain of training would change between them. But I love Lee's speech generating device, which because we always think about like, well, device, there's a lot of positives to it and it's better than no communication, but there's like, there's a technological barrier, you have to program it. But in this case, wasn't it cool that every single time he'd press my way, it would keep going to pages where he could give even more detailed information.
I actually love that, yeah.
So what a great way to take out that adult prompt, because your device just has that prompt built in. Well, of course, if you say my way, you probably could then specify details of my way after the fact, and the device just does it for you. So it's a nice visual prompt that's very naturally occurring and doesn't require an adult to continue asking questions and then fade those extra questions out. Now the question is going to be, okay, but were they just engaging in a chain of behavior where they just kept saying the same things over and over and over again? So again, it's really just a longer ombudsman rather than actually specifying man. So they looked at conditional probabilities to see if did those mans, the specifying mans, only occur under the context of specific evocative control. So pretty much they'd say, okay, which EO is being present, which EO is absent. After, again, they taught the specifying mans, they were seeing them occurring at pretty stable rates. And then they'd sort of sum it all up and you get a percentage of, okay, is this occurring across all the across all the evocative situations, across some of them, just the relevant ones. So our results, again, it's not going to be surprising that severe problem behavior dropped when they used the ombudsman, because that's what all the research we've seen tells us will happen from functional communication on. But all of them were able to learn their specifying mans as well. All done, stuff, play with me. For Raj, he continued having near zero rates of problem behavior throughout. And once he was taught the specifying mans, stopped using his ombudsman because he was using his specifying mans instead. Cole, again, learned his escape intangible items, specifying mans. He did have some low rates of problem behavior, but nothing too severe. And then independently started using his mans around man compliance. The authors say he did have the best verbal repertoire coming into this study, so that may have been why he was able to spontaneously start using his novel man without being trained to use it specifically. Lee learned his mans for escape intangibles. Then he learned his mans for attention. They did notice that he pretty much just kept asking for bubbles when he was taught his tangible specifying mans. But when they removed the bubbles, he would ask for other things.
I only want to ask for bubbles too.
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty awesome.
Love bubbles.
But when bubbles aren't available, you want to have something else you can ask for too, right? He also had no problem behavior after the baseline condition. So once he was trained to start using functional communication, problem behavior vanished. And then looking at the conditional probability analysis, it did seem that specifying mans were occurring under appropriate establishing events by the end of treatment. So for Raj, his specifying mans were occurring, in 100% of the relevant evocative situations, 71% and 78%. Sorry, 71 and 78% of the three occurrences in which they were kind of probing this. Cole was 100%. Lee was like 99 and 96% when manding escape, and for his Kindle with bubbles available, it was 100% because he loved those bubbles. So it does seem that if you want to start with an ombudsman, you should be able to then train specifying mans without seeing a significant increase in problem behavior. Now, the authors here, and I mean, it makes sense that they would recommend this for a lot of reasons. This is sort of their stock in trade of this as a treatment approach would suggest, but I think all of us would agree to some extent at least, that you want to have the easiest, lowest response effort manned topography for your client. And since the student is getting access to synthesized reinforcement, we would expect that manned to be learned very quickly because it's accessing a high level, magnitude, quality of reinforcement. So we should see a significant decrease in problem behavior very, very quickly. Then you might want to teach the specific mans. But again, the questions also still kind of remain, all right, well, how much slow progression of the evocative or the EO conditions do you need to have to keep those low rates of behavior? Because they went pretty slow in this study. Do you always need to go that slow? Could you have combined a few of these mans? Then the question that Jackie had kind of raised is, does it really make sense to always start with an ombudsman? And no, probably not. Again, if you're not talking about problem behavior, no, you want to start with your specifying mans right away. There may be times that you don't, but when problem behavior is not involved, you can probably just get going with the specifying mans immediately. Now, you may also use this if you did, say, an FA, or you're looking, and there's just only one condition in which the child has problem behavior. It's just that demand condition. They have no problem when people take toys. They have no problem with diverted attention. It's just demands. All right, so maybe we want to teach an escape or an all-done response there. That may make sense. But if you're talking about problem behavior that's multiply maintained, you may want to use that ombudsman. Or, again, if you're talking about problem behavior that's maintained by access to many reinforcers, but they're all in the same class, you may want to choose which one's going to be easiest for the client. Again, if there's not a safety concern, you'd probably just teach a less all-encompassing manned for that same class of item. So stuff, even though that could be considered in some ways an omnibus manned, it's not exactly the same way that we think of it. You could also kind of look at some of this to see, are you seeing reinforcers consumed at the same rate after you've done your assessment? If not, then okay, maybe you want to start going into your specifying mans a lot earlier, because you know the problem behavior is not necessarily going to be controlled by, or problem behavior won't be evoked by the same kind of removal or change in environment. So maybe you just get started on your specifying mans. But again, the other caution here is you want to make sure no matter when you add your specifying mands, make sure they're happening under evocative control rather than all I taught was a different omnibus mand in which the child just asked for 50 things in a consistent chain of behavior. And you can just sort of do that by looking. If I'm only removing one class of reinforcer, am I hearing every single specifying mand, in which case, you didn't teach it very well? Or am I seeing that they always occur in that same sequence, right? These are the questions you want to ask yourself, or do your own conditional probability check. So
As one does.
As one does, So question answered. You can teach an omnibus mand and you can teach specifying mands, and the two do not preclude the occurrence of the other.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
I'm glad that they did that study.
Yeah, it was a good question study. I like those.
Did you notice that this study was under review for like 2 years?
Yeah.
Wow, really?
Yes. So way to go, Shannon.
Nice.
Dr. Ward, you got it. You got
All
it
right.
out there. It's a really good piece of research.
All right, let's move into dissemination station.
We got to move this along.
All right. Well, I think each of these articles has some real strengths, and you could look at each one of them. Not a single one of them is going to tell you this is exactly how to do man training. So if you're looking for that, go back to some of your other books on doing man training. But it does look at a couple different variables, such as should you use an ombudsmand or not? And I think we talked about, well, it's going to depend on the situation in which you are training, whether you want to start with specifying or an ombudsmand. We looked at using speech-generating devices. I think that's a great one as a review if you are training other people to do manned training with or without a device. And we talked about a cool kind of assessment to sort of look at where students are and what the trajectory of their man training might be, which, again, I really think people should take a look at that again. I'd like to kind of see this one come back out.
I sent it to my clinic managers, and I was like, maybe we should do this.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
That's all I have for that one. Good job, Rob, disseminating.
That was pretty much it.
That was helpful. I was just going to say, you could look at the verbal behavior approach by Mary Barbera if you want some nuts and bolts on how you might approach teaching some of these verbal operants.
Cool. What about your pairings, Diana?
Pairings. It's time for pairings.
Pairings.
All right. So I didn't actually prepare a snack for you guys because I wanted to find out, what do you want? What's the snack you would eat right now?
Cool American Doritos.
I would like a tart.
What kind? Plum?
Yeah.
She's gonna have problem behavior. Use the ombudsman tart.
I want all of the tart. I want a fruit tart. I want one that has multiple fruits on it.
Oh, you did specify your man.
That sounds delicious. A stone fruit tart.
Yeah, yum.
Okay. I want Nutella French toast.
I want that too.
With bananas.
I want that too.
Oh, I wish I could have that.
Me too.
That sounds so delicious. Okay. So you could eat any of those, or, probably the thing that you actually like to eat while you listen to any of these episodes that also relate back. So we have episode 22, in which we discussed AAC, episode 28, in which we discussed FCT, episode 70, in which we discussed manding specifically for information with Dr. Sarah Lachago, episode 79, where we talked about teaching tacting at TACT. It was a live episode. Episode 116, where we talked about transfer of stimulus control for tacting. Oh, that was with Dr. Mary Barbera. Or you could look at episode 207, where we talk about incidental teaching, because this comes up. How do you teach manding in that context as well? So any of those would be good to go back in the annals.
Cool.
Yeah. Great.
That's it.
That's it. All right. And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you all so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed our episode. Please rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff on your favorite podcast player, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere you get podcasts, certainly. You can find us on all the socials as ABA Inside Track. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to get access to all of the links to all of the articles that we discussed, as well as to all of our previous episodes. And one other place you might want to check out if you want even more ABA Inside Track content would be our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for $5 a month, you can get all of our episodes a week ahead of time, as well as get access to our quarterly live episodes where you get to vote on the topic, except for our most current one where that's not actually the case. But don't worry, we're going to add some extra fun things, as well as a free CE for attending any of those or watching our post-video posts. For $10 a month, though, you can get that plus access to our extra mega long book club podcast, Once a quarter, we read a book that we think is relevant to behavior analysts, and we discuss it usually, actually every single time. So I don't want to say usually, every single time with book club guy Alan Haberman. And we just recorded, and at the time of this, you've probably gotten a preview, if not the full thing, a recent discussion on skeptical thinking with the book Calling Bullshit by Bergstrom and West, where we talked about being skeptical about the data in our modern world. All of those come with 2 CEs. And for subscribing, you get access to all of our book clubs right off the bat for no additional charges. A big thank you. And again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Finally, I bet you were trying to say, where's that second secret code word? It's here, folks. Here's your second secret code word. If you like CEs for this episode, it's Baker. Baker, like the baker who would make the French toast and Nutella that Diana so craves. And the fruit tart as well. Would they bake my chips? No, because those are fried and terrible for you.
They're fried, not baked.
All right, some final thanks. Big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, for Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye!
Bye!